Thank you so much. Anybody else recording the meeting today?
Or taking pictures?
Anybody taking pictures?
Everybody's here.
Everybody's taking. I'm just saying, if you want to post your pictures, you do need to get permission from the people that you are photographing before you post them anywhere online. So just to say that, thank you. We're going to try and do this in 2 hours today. We have a lot of content, so I wanted to just give you that. And in order to help us do that, I popped up a sheet over there for parking lot questions. If something comes up as a question during the presentation that needs clarifying right away, by all means, ask your question. But if it's something that it needs more time, there are some post-it notes on the table over there. It would be really awesome if you could pop it on a post-it note and put it onto the parking lot there. We have time at the end for questions. So, good afternoon. We're the People's Fernald Working Group, a group of concerned citizens that believe that there needs to be more accountability and transparency from the Mayor's office regarding the Fernald property. My name is Nina Ugrin. Also here today is Jonathan Paz, George Darcy, George again over there, Diana Young. One of our other members, Lizzie Gellis, is away today. She's not here with us, but we do have a couple of guests as well. We have Josh Castroff, who's going to host a breakout session for us, and we have Bryan Parcival, who you're going to hear from in a few minutes. Our goal is to influence the decision makers so that the project reflects the desire of the majority of Waltham residents, and that the eventual outcome is respectful to and honours the many thousands of residents that were part of Fernald's story. We truly thank you for taking time to come and join us for this meeting today, to continue the dialogue and provide your input. We hope you each picked up 2 maps on your way in. The first map contains the proposal that is considered the current project by the Mayor's office, and the second map is blank, for us to be able to help you to understand all the nuances of what will be presented this afternoon. At the last meeting back in November, we discussed the current state of the 196 acres, and we also began to detail some of the plans that the Mayor has both proposed and indeed has started to work on. George Darcy will provide us with an update today, and later we'll break out into some groups so that we can hear directly from you and get your input. At the end of the meeting, we'll decide some action items that you'll be able to work on should you wish to continue to be part of this effort. We want to kick off this meeting with a presentation by our guest, Bryan Parcival. Bryan was hired by the City of Waltham as mandated by the acquisition process to conduct a recordation of the entire 196-acre Fernald parcel, and he has intimate knowledge of the entire site. Bryan has photographed the Fernald landscapes in each and every building. His words will shed some insight into the history of this important site, the oldest site in the Western Hemisphere for the treatment of developmentally disabled individuals. This is the very first time that Bryan's work is being presented to the public. And I'm going to ask you to please join me to welcome Bryan.
Hello, my name is Bryan Parcival. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you about a subject that is incredibly important to me and a place that I find unique and like no other. The Fernald State School, the Waltham Fernald Developmental Center, formerly the Massachusetts State School for the Feeble-Minded. No place I have ever photographed, and I have photographed a lot of abandoned institutions, no place has ever grabbed me by the soul the way Fernald has. And I think there are many, many reasons for it. Obviously, it's long, deep, and important history. As mentioned, the most important institution of its kind in the Western Hemisphere. And Walter Fernald himself, for whom the place is most recently named, was such a pioneer in developmental psychiatry and care for the mentally handicapped. So Fernald is full of shadows and echoes. Echoes of the far past, the distant past, and certainly the recent past. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the State Boys Rebellion, if you know anything about this property, book by Michael D'Antonio. This gets into some of Fernald's darker history in the 1940s and 50s. But I also think we need to really acknowledge the reforms at the institution after Judge Torres' intervention in the 1970s through the 80s. I couldn't find a good book on that, but this one's pretty good. This is an employee handbook that I think actually talks quite a bit about the care for the people at the institution. So we're dealing with a place with a very complex and complicated history. And I thought I would end with this, not end the presentation, but end this little video with this little transition that shows the schoolhouse, which is where the State Boys Rebellion took place, or partially. Now let's go into some of the more practical stuff. Okay, this is an aerial view of the campus. And I'd like to walk a little bit through history. So the campus is situated between the front entrance on Capello Road. I don't know if you can see my cursor there. And of course the rear entrance on Waverly Oaks Road. Originally it was reversed. So looking at the property just simply as a blank in history, before Waltham purchased, or I'm sorry, before the state of Massachusetts purchased this property, there were already some buildings on site, including these farmhouses along Capello Road and a farm close to Waverly Oaks Road. This farm was later renovated for the purpose of the institution. The very first building was the West Building. What we called West at that time, it was simply the asylum. This was designed by William Preston in collaboration with George Tarbell, who was more or less in charge of the shift from Boston into Waltham. This was an all-in-one building. It was the school, it was residence, it was infirmary, it was dining, it was recreation, it was everything. And then there was a little boiler room that came with it, later called Belmont House. The very first building in the expansion in the early 1890s, when Walter Fernald himself was a very young psychiatrist and medical doctor, associated with working, for the institution, later becoming its third superintendent. This was the very first building that was built. This was the boys' dormitory. And the reason this one, I think, came first was because boys from the School for the Feeble-Minded in Boston were being trucked up or carted up into Waltham to dig up field stones and work the farm. And then the field stones later laid the foundations of the early buildings. There were ideas, of course, this was, I don't think, considered slave labor. I do think this was at least somewhat nobly intended to, let's get them out of the dark building in Boston and into the fresh air. Oops. Pretty quickly following the boys' dorm came the schoolhouse, an incredibly significant structure historically. Now, I think both of these are incredibly important. to get into some of that a little bit later. Sorry? Oh, sorry, yeah, so this was, the boys' dorm was 1891, and so was the school. Okay. Along the same year came the original administration building called the Waverly Building, and Walter Fernald never actually called this place the Fernald, and he never called it the School for the Feeble-Minded. Oh, thank you. He called it the Waverly School. And then the next building that came along, two buildings that came along were kind of a laundry and boiler building, and then the Chipman Hall, which is the girls' dormitory. So we have, I think, some very important history right here on this page. Advancing fairly quickly through the 1890s, the boys' home was built. So as the young boys would age up into teenagers and older, they would move up into the boys' home. And then the original infirmary, which came in 1893, I think. Following fairly quickly, still in the mid-1800s, North Hall, McDougal Hall, and then a pretty rapid burst of expansion into staff housing, and then another quite important building, which was just as important as the schoolhouse, is this one, the manual training building. So I draw attention to the schoolhouse and manual training because so much of what we consider special education was developed in these two buildings. And this was right here in Waltham, Massachusetts. Incredibly influential on educational practices and manual training practices moving forward, not just for the mentally handicapped, but for special ed needs writ large. Incredibly important history right here. More expansion, through the late 1800s. The campus just kept growing and growing and filling up with people, both staff and also residents in its care. Another big burst of activity happened in the 1930s. You can see that big leap right there. And those of you who know the current campus at all probably know these two buildings most. The new administration building, the one with the big clock tower on top, and then the auditorium, which is right next to it. The green unit, which in some ways became the heart of the institution through the 1950s and 60s, and then yet another expansion into more residences, and then the Schreiber Center. And then after the reforms, that's when kind of these slightly more independent living cottage facilities were built along with a new food services building. And then that brings the campus up to the point when the state decided to close it, or not that long before the state decided to close the institution. So when the state ultimately did close the school, it had condemned several buildings. So the boys' dorm, Waverly Hall, the old admin, Chipman, girls' dorm, the original infirmary, West, the original asylum, boiler room, farmhouse, and Trapello Cottage, which was actually the oldest building on campus. These buildings were fenced off, and a lot of, I was going to say, well, I'm going to get to the a lot of later. Sorry. In addition, these three buildings right here, Tarbell Hall, McDougal Hall, and Dolan Hall, these had been used as women's and homeless shelters by the state toward the end of the use of the property. And it's this property that Waltham purchased in 2014, and where the present era of the Fernald Institution begins. So when Waltham purchased this property, you can see a pretty large number of buildings, some of which were condemned. Those are the condemned buildings are in blue. This lighter blue, lavender color. Those buildings were not in great shape. They could possibly have been rehabilitated with some effort at that point. But if we were to look at the condition of most other buildings on this property, there were quite a few with power still on, with running water, intact windows, and that could be repurposed or reused. That's this number of buildings. That's a lot right there. And on top of that, the ones that just highlighted in yellow, every single one of those could have been more or less reasonably used for housing without a whole lot of effort. Effort for sure, but could be reused. These buildings were demolished between 2015, 19, and up into 2022. And probably a good reason up here. This is for restoration of wetlands. So in a way, it was kind of a shame to lose some actually very good independent living cottages, but I can absolutely understand why those were demolished.
Back.
Sorry?
One more time, just back.
Oh, sure. So the cottages up here, green unit, and the Malone Park cottages. All of these, I think, certainly could have been reused for housing, but they're also all on wetlands, and they were illegally built in the first place. So fine in that way for them to have gone. But that still leaves, look at all of these buildings in yellow or orange that could be repurposed for different things, including for housing. I'd like to draw attention at this point to one building in particular. So all the way down here, Wallace Hall. Wallace Hall and Seguin Hall were both originally built as infirmaries in the mid-1930s, and then were later converted to residential facilities. Both were able to house 32 people, so that was a total of 64 people between the two buildings. I'm going to use Wallace as an example. I'll put this little slideshow over here for a moment. Okay, Wallace Hall was built in 1936 on the same double Y plan as Seguin Hall. It functioned as an infirmary initially, and then used as a 32-bed dormitory, as well as short-term non-intensive care programs for community-based clients in transition. The building was named after Dr. George L. Wallace, who was an assistant to Dr. Fernald for many years. In 1907, Dr. Wallace was appointed the first superintendent of the Rentham State School, built to alleviate overcrowding at the Fernald. I'll skip over some of the architectural descriptions other than to say that from a historical perspective, this design was pioneered at Metropolitan State Hospital, also on Trapello Road, across from Fernald. And most importantly, Wallace Hall was renovated in 1984. So it had all new HVAC systems, at least new as of 1984, but still newer than 1936, power and water. Today, the building is completely unusable because of vandalism, weather damage, rodent infestation, mold. The structure itself is sound, and salvage is possible, but not without completely gutting and rebuilding the interior. With that in mind, this is the floor plan. You can see the unique double Y structure. This is an exercise in what might have been, by the way. The advantage of the double Y structure is it lets in a lot of light year round, with that X formation at either end. Here's some exterior views of Wallace. Seguin is exactly the same. A lot of light year round, spacious, ramp accessible, front and back. Windows were all intact when Waltham purchased this property. There were two beautiful sun porches on the back of the building, same as Seguin. I'll show you the interior when we bought the property. Power's still on. It's dirty. Could have used some cleanup for sure. That's what it looked like in 2015.
Is it still there?
You will see in a moment. And let's look at Wallace today. (2023).
Well, this was because the kids were hanging out there.
Kids and raccoons.
But there were kids, because I called the police every weekend.
Yeah.
When bands of kids
Yeah.
walked parked on my street.
Yeah.
Now they're on Chase Road and all the other, they moved out of Sparkle and Porter. And Sparkle and Monroe, and they're on the other side too. So people see, there are a lot of cars, doors
Yeah.
shut, look out the windows, you see kids, call the police. Go down to the phone.
When I was working on the recordation project, I called the police probably 3 or 4 times every day I was there. At a certain point, they got sick of it. And I don't blame them. It shouldn't be their job. Security should have been hired, for that property.
Well, they did have cameras, and from what the mayor told me, they literally shut out all the and destroyed all the cameras.
Yeah, some of them were part of the recordation project, and there were a good number of them just stolen. And I know who stole them. So, is there a question to that?
Just please, people who are speaking, really speak up loud.
Oh, sorry.
Can I just say, we're going to have breakout sessions later on, so if you've got comments like this is going to be the perfect place to bring them to, will be our breakout sessions, and then we'll present back to the whole group at the end of the breakout. So I really appreciate your input. Thank you so much. Let's bring it to the breakout.
Okay, but this was a good point to bring up. As you can see, there's an enormous amount of damage to this building. Vandalism let the weather in. Vandalism let the animals in. Weather allowed for the deterioration and decay of the buildings. While doing the recordation project, I met hundreds and hundreds of people who should not have been on that campus, who had no reason to be on that campus, and some who had come from as far away as Wisconsin to bash windows on this campus because it spread like wildfire online that there's an abandoned zombie-haunted insane asylum in Waltham, and people would converge at Fernald just to smash it. And so, especially in 2020 during the pandemic, when kids had nothing to do except sit at home, they overran that campus. And that's where the majority of the damage to this campus actually came from. I personally, I think, saved a couple of kids from falling through floors. A couple of kids who were breaking into one of the buildings, even they could have walked around and just walked in a big hole in the front, but they weren't that smart. And they were wearing shorts, climbing up a rusty, collapsing staircase. There were girls walking through one of the buildings in flip-flops, all over broken glass, holding her little ice drink. And it's like, oh my God. So, oh my God is right. All right, Wallace I just used as one example because it, to me, it's one of the, I guess, most clear. The recordation project was delivered to the city on 6 hard drives. So in other words, all the photos, well, most of the photos that we took, there were a lot of repeats, were delivered to the city last year. And we have a companion website that's not actually owned by the city, but I do hope the city will link to it. And this includes a history and photographs of every single building, on that campus. This is still, unfortunately, password protected. My colleague Tom Kirsch, who built the website, is optimizing it for cell phone use right now. So as soon as it is ready, which I hope is literally within a week, I will send info to Jonathan and Diana and George who could share it with everybody who signed up on this list today. But you will see a lot of these comparative photos, where buildings in 2015 versus buildings today. Okay, let's move on from Wallace. So more or less Fernald, as it stands today. Again, just as a reminder, the buildings in yellow could have been repurposed for housing. The buildings in orange could have been other kinds of mixed use. And then the buildings in blue are the ones that were slated for demolition by the state. What's reusable today? I would like this image to resonate with you. That. So from this to that. And even then, this is a lot of work. Warren Hall and North Hall are probably in the best structural condition, and both of these were residences. So if we are thinking about housing as a concern, conceivably these buildings, with an amount of effort, could be restored. East Nurse, West Nurse, these are staff housing. It's like, they're both like dormitories with very tiny rooms, but they're still rooms. And both of those buildings are in reasonable shape, but would need a good amount of work. Hillside Cottage was the original superintendent's house, later used as a group home. It's actually in pretty good shape, even though every single window has been smashed, as is the case with most of the buildings. Now, one thing that's actually very nice is Cardinal Cottage has been renovated, and it's quite beautiful. It looks great. I don't know what the future use is, but they did a really lovely job with it. Now, if in a fantasy world, Waltham or the state were to actually restore these buildings and then look at some of the other buildings that could potentially be restored, then we can put some of these back on the table. But pretty much every single one of them at this point would need to be gutted, and it would be a pretty vast operation. So there is a question then of viability, with some of these structures. And to me, the question then comes to, well, what is important in terms of possible housing, considering how many people we pass every day sleeping on the streets, Main Street and Moody Street? What is potentially viable but not historical? And then what is worth preserving for historical significance? There we go. So for historical significance, I'd like to draw attention to these buildings right here. So if you remember the original expansion of the campus, how it kind of moved from the west side over to the east side, Walter Fernald himself had a huge hand in designing, along with William Preston, this section. So these buildings in red, I think, are the ones that have some unique historical significance in terms of any of the state institutions in this country, and I mean in this state and outside of the state, across the country. So, as a reminder, we've got the schoolhouse, Waverly Hall, the original administration, Chipman, the girls' dorm, and the boys' dorm. Boys' dorm never had a name, all the others had names. So again, as a reminder, the schoolhouse, foundation for special education in this country, incredibly important. The building needs to be gutted at this point. It didn't. Even in 2019, that building did not need to be gutted. In 2019, that building was still easily salvageable. Now it's a mess. But it could be done, and I think it should be done. And I would personally love to see this building repurposed as a special education disability needs center for advocacy, for education. It's right here. It's one of the most important schoolhouses in the country. It's 3 miles from here, and this one can be restored. And it has a beautiful gymnasium, needs a new floor, but we would have a function hall, we would have a gathering space. Schoolhouse and gymnasium, I think, should be preserved for historical reasons. Boys dorm. I'm going to show you some photos of these buildings in a minute. Boys dorm to me is the most intriguing building on this campus. And the reason is there's nothing else like it in any other state institution. When George Tarbell and William Preston, the architect, were kind of conceiving of this expansion, the boys dorm, in my opinion, was probably considered aspirational. It's a castle-like 3-story structure. For considering who they were housing, all these kids who were working on the farm all day, it's quite a magnificent building. It's the only, until later, it was the only 3-story structure there on the campus. But what was so fascinating to me is that once Walter Fernald really took power, he realized how impractical this building was. And so with the architect Preston, Walter Fernald's influence was really exerted on the girls' dormitory, Chipman Hall. And then Chipman Hall became the model for every other residence on the campus. McDougal Hall, North Hall, Dolan, even the staff residences were all modeled on Chipman because Fernald himself thought that they got it right with that one. And that was imitated even beyond Waltham. So here we have 3 absolutely unique buildings. Schoolhouse and gym for its impact on history, and then the boys' dorm and the girls' dorm for their architectural advances, or aspirations and advances. Right here, 3 miles from us. Nationally significant in the Western Hemisphere. Waverly Hall is the original administration building. I do think there's a case to be made to preserve part of it. It is a historical building. It is the original administration building, which means it's where all the decisions were made. Yes?
Can you show which way is north, south? I can't quite make out the rosette.
Yep, north is this way. That's north. And
Waverly is where?
And, sorry?
Waverly is where?
Okay, so here's the compass. So that's north, south, west, east. This is Waverly. This is the boys' dorm. This is the schoolhouse. This is Chipman Hall. I and my colleagues like to call these the core 4. So with that in mind, let's look at this one. This is the schoolhouse. Boys' dorm. Oops, I don't know what happened here. Somehow I zoomed in, sorry about that. Let's move it over. There we go, school. So if we're looking north, the school is east, boys' dorm is north, Chipman Hall is south, Waverly is west. This is the school today. Still in good shape, structurally. This is the facade of Chipman Hall. Chipman Hall is not salvageable. There's a reason it was condemned. There's a reason the boys' dorm was condemned, and there's a reason Waverly was condemned. They're all in massive and active states of collapse. I would like to propose saving a chunk of each one. A bit of the facade of Chipman Hall, boys' dorm, and Waverly. And more on that in a sec. That's Waverly. Facade, you can see these beautiful kind of curved corners where the offices were. This is the boys' dorm. In front of it, you can see it's in a pretty bad state of collapse on one side. It's pretty dangerous. You can see from the side, it's castle-like structure. This is the facade, which I do think it could possibly be preserved. This is what's on the east side of the building. Nothing. It collapsed pretty dramatically. But after hearing some of Walter Fernald's opinions about this building, particularly in regard to ventilation, which then led to some of the intervention with the architect on Chipman Hall. What's so fascinating is you can see the whole ventilation apparatus collapsed. You can see the guts. And then you can turn around and look at the side where it's still intact. So it's a unique study as a building, you know, to look one direction and see everything that went into it splayed all over the ground, and the other side and see what it actually had been at one time. One reason why I proposed this notion of facades is because these four buildings, Boys Dorm right here in the north, school, gymnasium, Chipman down here, Waverly right here, they surround an intentional park and courtyard, connected by sidewalks for accessibility. And if you save a little bit, you know, that one, a little bit of that one, a little bit of that one, and then preserve this building, you have the core history of Fernald right there with a memorial park right in the middle of the pieces. This is in Providence, Rhode Island. This building I find inspirational because it was torn down many years ago, but they kept the facade. And this one has a parking lot behind it, but it is possible, you know, architecturally to preserve a chunk of a building. And so I know that there is a memorial in the works for Fernald. And I trust and I hope it's a beautiful one. But sometimes people miss the point of memorials if they're disconnected architecturally or disconnected spatially. To actually preserve a little bit of some of these buildings means we were right there within its history. I also would like to point out that Peddix Island, the old Fort Andrews, has done something like this. You know, they've preserved pieces of the barracks and some of the various other military use buildings. Sometimes a whole building, and if it's a whole building, it's properly boarded up so you can't get into it. Medfield State Hospital, by the way, did the same thing. Medfield State Hospital does not have a vandalism problem. Even though most of their buildings are still there, it's wide open to the public. But the buildings have been boarded up properly, and the public police the grounds because they can walk their dogs, they can jog, they can hang out. And the city sometimes leases some of the buildings to movie companies to make movies, like Shutter Island, and among others, on the Medfield campus. There are ways to do this if we actually have some foresight, some vision, some imagination. Now, I realize a lot of this comes down to money, but there are also creative ways to get that too. So, this is Walter Fernald and his children early on in his tenure there. This is the north building. There's the boys' dorm. There's Waverly Hall, right there. And I think we do have a chance to save some of that. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Let's take a couple of minutes while I just pull the rest of the presentation up and we're going to use the bathroom. So grab a refreshment from the back.
George, here's your lightsaber.
Lightsaber, yeah. And I'll just get us wrapped up. If anybody didn't sign in and you're going to want the URL to that website or to stay in touch with us, please remember to sign in at the front.
Does that? I can probably hear you.
We know who's here today and we can get
Hi, if you're listening. I don't know, just watching.
Thank you.
I'm gonna stop it for now. We'll be back.
Are you live or just recording?
You're live.